Students, this is a recording, a narration for the endocrine system. So this narration will cover the entire content that you're required to know for the endocrine system. So like I said, when we were doing the nervous system, both of these systems are the prime regulators of homeostasis. The nervous system was the fast-acting system, whereas the endocrine system functions much slower because the endocrine system produces hormones which have to travel in the bloodstream. And so hormones take a bit longer to arrive at the site where they're going to have an effect. However, hormones also can cause effects that are much longer lasting in the body. So what is the endocrine system? It is a group of glands and or organs, which you will find on the corresponding diagram. But the word endocrine should always be associated with hormones. So a hormone is like a chemical messenger. It is produced by a gland or organ, and it will have an effect usually very far away from the organ that actually has produced it. And the effect usually is regulated through negative feedback. Most hormones are regulated via negative feedback. Positive feedback is never used for homeostatic regulation. If you've never studied negative and positive feedback before, then you will need to review this to understand a negative feedback loop. And so when we use the word negative in everyday language, it often has, a negative connotation. Something bad's going to happen. That's not the case here. Negative feedback is a response system where when a variable in the body like blood glucose goes too high or too low, insulin and glucagon are two hormones that can be used to bring it back to normal. So when we come up with the instances where negative feedback will be used, I will explain it. There's only one hormone that we will talk about that uses positive feedback, and that's the hormone oxytocin. So the function then of the endocrine system is to regulate many body functions, and you can see the list here is quite long. There's growth hormone, helping with growth, how fast we burn glucose in cellular respiration, which is called metabolism, as well as all the other metabolic activities that occur in cells, the regulation of blood pressure and blood volume, both of which are related to water balance in the body, the concentration of chemicals in blood. So as you probably know, blood has a liquid portion, and many substances can dissolve readily in this liquid portion. Glucose, for example, amino acids. And then there are the ions, sodium ions, potassium ions, calcium ions, magnesium ions, hydrogen ions, bicarbonate ions, a lengthy list that are also regulated using hormones. Then there is fertility, obviously, which I think everybody has heard of, estrogen, testosterone, and then our circadian rhythm, which is our sleep and wake cycle. Most glands in the endocrine system are made from what is called epithelial tissue, but some of them are also nervous tissue. So the ones that have nervous tissue can respond to the sympathetic nervous system. And if you remember from our study of the nervous system, The sympathetic nervous system is specifically going to drive the fight or flight response. So in terms of their biochemistry, this slide is really meant not for you to memorize all of the, the chemical structures that you see here. That is beyond the level of this course, but to give you an understanding of the fact that most hormones are protein-based. So they're not carbohydrates, for example. There are a few that are lipid-based, and these are referred to as the steroid hormones. And they're referred to as the steroid hormones because the steroid group is this group of these ring structures, 4 of them, chemically bonded in a particular way. And so if we look at testosterone, for example, we would see this steroid ring structure. If we look at progesterone, we would also see the same steroid ring structure. Obviously, this steroid structure, to differentiate between these 2 hormones, will have additional molecules attached to them. But when we refer to a steroid hormone, we mean that the hormone has as its core component in their chemical structure these 4 ring structures here. So where are these endocrine glands? So from superior to inferior, we have the hypothalamus. So this is, you may have to Google this to get a better picture of the brain to see where the hypothalamus is. The hypothalamus is below the thalamus, if you can remember. So if this is the thalamus here, the hypothalamus, which actually is not identified here, the pituitary is shown here, the hypothalamus would be roughly about here. Because the pituitary gland, which is another major endocrine gland, hangs off a stalk, a length of the hypothalamus. The pineal gland is usually on the opposite side, and that's over there. So we've got hypothalamus, pineal, and pituitary in the brain. Then around just below the voice box, so the larynx is the voice box. Just below the voice box we have the thyroid gland, and sort of superimposed on the thyroid gland, usually on its posterior aspect, we have 4 glands that are called the parathyroid. There's also the thymus, which is approximately in the chest region, and we'll leave it at that for now. The adrenals always sit on top of the kidneys, so that's why you're seeing them here, but the kidneys are below there and there. So I think by now you have realized that you do need to have a good idea of where some of the body's organs are in a section of the human body, so that you can roughly pinpoint, apart from the heart and the lungs, where do we find the stomach, where do we find the liver, etc. This gland here is the pancreas. This fish-shaped organ is right here. So the stomach would roughly be, so we would have the diaphragm here. The diaphragm is the band of muscle that separates the thoracic from the abdominal cavity, and the stomach, the esophagus actually perforates. So the esophagus is a long tube from the back of the throat that goes to the stomach, and the stomach would be right there. Liver would be on this side over here. So all of these organs, stomach, liver, pancreas, we'll talk about in the digestive system, they're all in the abdominal cavity. So we've met the pancreas, and then of course we have the ovaries. So this is a composite diagram, obviously diagrammatic, showing the ovaries and the testes. So those are the endocrine glands. Now, when one is studying the endocrine system, here are the main pieces of information that you need to focus on. The name of the gland, which hormone or hormones it produces, and then what is the effect of that hormone. So you'll discover that hormones have target sites, but they also have specific effects. So that's the way our study will be sort of progressing. So the pituitary gland was often described as the master gland because it controls many other hormones. But one of the most important pieces of information for you to know is that there is a fabulous connection between the pituitary and the hypothalamus. Now, the pituitary gland is not one gland. It's actually two glands. So there's an anterior pituitary and there's a posterior pituitary. So if I could sort of try and draw a diagram here, you have a lobe, that's the anterior pituitary, and then there's another lobe that is the posterior pituitary. So let's say that's the anterior pituitary and that's the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is endocrine tissue. It's nervous tissue. And the anterior pituitary has a very different connection. So the hypothalamus would be roughly about here. It has a very different connection to the hypothalamus. Why do I say that? Because the hypothalamus makes two hormones that it stores in the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary does not make any hormones of its own. It stores two hormones that are made by the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary, on the other hand, makes several hormones. However, it only makes those hormones if the hypothalamus actually sends messages via hormones to tell it to make those hormones. So it's an important distinction to make. So let's see what we have on our slides. The hypothalamus lies superior to the pituitary gland. Good. The hypothalamus makes two hormones which are stored in the posterior pituitary and different hormones that activate the anterior pituitary. Pituitary gland is called the master gland because it makes and releases many hormones at specific times in development. We've got puberty shown in brackets here. Well, that's because the anterior pituitary, for example, makes growth hormone. So growth hormone, we have growth hormone being released from the time we're born, to help us grow and develop. But during puberty, we get a big surge in growth hormone. And then roughly at about 21 years of age, growth hormone production is really almost negligible because we stop growing then. Now, some of the hormones that come from the anterior pituitary control other endocrine glands. So for example, the anterior pituitary produces a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone. And that hormone has to go to the thyroid gland to tell the thyroid gland to produce its hormone. So what we're seeing here, thyroid, is levels of control within the system. The hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary, telling it when it should release thyroid stimulating hormone. And only when thyroid stimulating hormone is sent to the thyroid gland, then the thyroid gland releases what is called thyroxine or thyroid hormone. And that hormone actually controls our metabolic rate. So if we get too much thyroid hormone, our cells will use up a lot of glucose and we will actually lose a lot of weight quickly because the body will tap into fat when it doesn't have glucose or glycogen to combust to produce ATP. That's if we have too much thyroid hormone. If we have too little thyroid hormone, so then there's a balance There's a specific amount of thyroid hormone that is always required. And so too much of any hormone, too little, if we have too little thyroid hormone, then we would start to gain weight rather quickly, because our cells will not be metabolizing the glucose, the food that we consume, and so it will deposit all that excess as fat. So there are a lot of disorders and diseases that actually arise from either malfunction of the endocrine gland, usually. Sometimes it could be a tumor on the gland. So in this image here, you're actually being shown what I was just illustrating, which is that the pituitary gland is not one gland. It actually has an anterior portion and a posterior portion. And both of those parts have a connection to the hypothalamus, but how the hypothalamus interacts with the anterior pituitary is very different from how it interacts with the posterior pituitary. So now we'll take a look at the two hormones that the hypothalamus makes and that is stored and released from the posterior pituitary. And the first one is a really important hormone called antidiuretic hormone, abbreviated ADH. Antidiuretic hormone targets the kidneys because the kidneys filter our blood throughout the entire day. What the kidneys do is they try to remove the bad stuff that's in blood. So any leftover drugs, any excess waste, metabolic waste, any excess water, those are removed from blood and they go out in urine. So urine is an excretory product. So antidiuretic hormone is specifically related to water balance in the body. So if you're dehydrated, antidiuretic hormone will be released and it will target the kidney and tell the kidneys, don't excrete the water in urine, absorb the water, keep it in blood. We will meet antidiuretic hormone again when we study the urinary system. The next one, oxytocin, may be familiar to some of you. Oxytocin is the hormone that causes contractions of the uterus during childbirth. And oxytocin is an example of a hormone that functions on a positive feedback loop. So what does that mean? Well, if we use the example of childbirth, oxytocin will cause contractions of the uterus initially. And I think we all know that for a child to be born, usually it takes many hours. So at the beginning, there's a small amount of oxytocin and you get some uterine contractions. The baby, usually the baby's head, enters the birth canal. Once that happens, the head of the baby puts a lot of pressure on the walls of the birth canal, and that wall is very sensitive to that pressure. And there's a loop, a feedback loop that goes back to the posterior pituitary that tells the posterior pituitary to release more oxytocin. More oxytocin causes more contraction. More contraction means that the baby moves further and further into the birth canal. Again, more of the baby in the birth canal means more pressure. More pressure means the feedback goes again to the posterior pituitary, which releases even more hormone, more oxytocin. More oxytocin causes more contraction. And that feedback causing more oxytocin and more contraction just keeps going on and on and on until the child is born. So positive feedback loops are not used for normal homeostasis. They're usually used for a significant event like this. Because positive feedback is not corrective. Negative feedback is corrective. Negative feedback minimizes or decreases or raises the initial stimulus. Positive feedback increases that stimulus until the event is completed, and then it shuts right off. So once the child is born, no more oxytocin is produced because there's no pressure on the walls of the birth canal. So oxytocin is the only hormone you will meet in this chapter that uses positive feedback. Now the anterior pituitary releases this list of hormones that we see here. We have growth hormone. The target is bones and muscles. I don't think that needs any explanation. Prolactin is a hormone, so anything that has lac in it, like lactose, lac, usually refers to milk. And prolactin targets the breasts. Breasts are called mammary glands in biology, and that stimulates milk production, so for the baby to be fed. The other three are what are called tropic hormones, because what they do is they target other endocrine glands. So we have FSH and LH, two hormones we will meet again in the reproductive system. So FSH and LH target the ovaries and testes, and obviously for egg and sperm production and maturation respectively. We have thyroid stimulating hormone, which I mentioned earlier, targets the thyroid gland and tells the thyroid gland to produce its own hormone. So all of these, ovaries, testes, thyroid gland, and now the adrenal gland, you saw them in the list of endocrine glands. So these are endocrine glands which can produce, they all produce their own hormones, but they cannot do it unless these hormones coming from the anterior pituitary are sent to them. So we have follicle stimulating hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and adrenocorticotropic hormone. Next, we have the pineal gland, and this will finish off our discussion for the brain region. So the pineal gland secretes melatonin. I understand that melatonin is available in the pharmacy. Whether it is true melatonin, I do not know. I was a bit surprised to find that. Melatonin regulates our sleep and wake cycle. So if you find that right now in winter you would like to sleep longer, it's because we do not have a lot of sunlight. The days are short, although right now they're actually getting longer, because in December 4 o'clock was pitch dark outside. But this gland responds to sunlight, daylight. So during the day, the pineal gland secretes very little melatonin, causing you to feel awake and alert. And at night, or actually in darkness, I should say, the levels of melatonin are at the highest, causing you to feel sleepy. And so, yes, if you travel across time zones, the pineal gland needs time to adjust to the difference in time, and it takes a long time sometimes to adjust. So that's the pineal gland. Now the thyroid. This one is really important. Located in the neck, so you do need to know the location, and wraps around the trachea. The trachea is the windpipe, and the windpipe is often shown by this sort of rings of cartilage whenever you look at an image of the upper respiratory tract. Image of the anterior view of the thyroid gland. Notice the butterfly shape of the thyroid, so that would be sort of the pale orange shown here. That would be a thyroid. Thyroid produces and secretes the hormone thyroxine, which regulates cellular metabolism. So cellular metabolism is cellular respiration, the combustion of glucose to produce carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. I did say a bit about thyroxine in the first couple of slides, so I won't repeat that. But there is a second really, really important hormone, which I alluded to, I think maybe when we were doing the skeletal system, as well as muscles, and why muscles can't contract unless calcium is present. Well, here we see there are two hormones actually which regulate calcium concentrations in blood. So calcium ion concentration in blood. Now, calcitonin is one of the hormones, and calcitonin is produced by the thyroid gland. The other hormone comes from the parathyroid glands, and that hormone is called parathyroid hormone. Here. So typically, if you have a meal, so let's put a little balance here. So let's say this is the normal level of calcium, Ca2+ in the blood. That's what we need normally for function. But if you have a meal that contains lots of dairy products, because they're probably our primary source of calcium. They're not the only food source of calcium, but it's the one that most of us use. So milk, yogurt, etc. So if you have a meal that contains a lot of calcium, then your blood level of calcium increases. That's what this arrow, this point here means, an increase in calcium. So instead of that calcium being let out of the body, what the body does is store it in bones. The hormone that's required for the storage in bone is calcitonin. So calcitonin will be secreted. Calcitonin is able to trigger osteoblasts, bone building cells, and they will take the calcium and build your bones and make your bones stronger. Let's say you're somebody who is lactose intolerant and you cannot have dairy products. You may be, finding that you have inadequate amounts. So this is below normal level here of calcium in the blood. If that's the case, then again, that low level of calcium in the blood triggers this hormone, parathyroid hormone, to be secreted. And parathyroid hormone targets the bones, and there are cells called osteoclasts that break down bone, and that allows for calcium to be released from the bone, and that released calcium goes into the bloodstream and brings the calcium concentration in the bloodstream back to normal. This is how negative feedback loops work. So a change, whether it is an increase from normal or a decrease from normal, there is a specific hormone that will cause that increase to be modified to come back to normal. By removing calcium out of blood, calcitonin effectively causes the calcium level in blood to fall back to normal. Once you get back to normal, the hormone is switched off. So a negative feedback loop is corrective. In this case, it reduced the stimulus. When we have too little calcium, a different hormone is used. Parathyroid hormone will cause the release of calcium from bone. That calcium is going to flow into blood. Once the concentration in blood gets back to normal, no more parathyroid hormone is secreted. This is also corrective. So both of these are negative feedback loops. It's not one is positive and one is negative. They both operate on a negative feedback loop. And that's how the majority of hormones function, on a negative feedback loop. So calcitonin and parathyroid hormones are called antagonistic because they affect the same variable, which is calcium levels in blood, but one can increase calcium levels in blood and the other one can decrease calcium levels in blood. Now for the adrenal gland, this one is very interesting, both anatomically and in terms of its hormones. I know you'll see a lot of information on this part of the slide, but let's just take it one step at a time. So this is the superior surface of the kidney, and there we see this is the adrenal gland here. And the adrenal gland can be divided into an outer portion, which is referred to as the cortex. So like I said, I think in a different slide, cortex refers to bark, the outer part of a tree. So the outer part of a gland is always the cortex, and the medulla is the middle. Now that medulla part is nervous tissue. That's the part that responds to the nervous system. The cortex does not respond to the nervous system. Okay, so you have two adrenal glands, each sit atop the kidneys and are composed of an outer cortex and an inner medulla. The cortex can be divided into additional zones, all of which produce different types of hormones. The adrenal cortex will produce two important hormones. So these are the only two that you are responsible for knowing. This one, aldosterone. So aldosterone is very important because it targets the kidney. So in that sense, very similar to antidiuretic hormone, it targets the kidney. And it's actually related to water balance too. But aldosterone focuses, or it's able to affect sodium ions and potassium ions in blood. So aldosterone will target the kidney. Remember, the kidney is filtering blood. And what it will do is, if we don't have enough sodium ions in the body, it will try to keep whatever sodium ions we have. So let's say, for example, you ate a lot, 2-3 bags of salty potato chips. You know that after eating the salty potato chips, you will drink lots of water. You're thirsty. Drinking lots of water usually means you'll go to the bathroom frequently. What your body is doing there is the salt, sodium ions, are dissolved in the water that you drank, which is in your blood. But because you had so much salt, sodium ions, from the 3 bag of potato chips, your body wants to get rid of it. We don't store excess sodium ions or potassium ions. So in order to get rid of the excess, as your blood is being filtered by the kidney, you will go to the bathroom, a lot of water will go out of your body, and all that excess sodium will also go out of the body at the same time. So salt balance and water balance in the body are actually linked. Because anytime the salt balance in your body falls, it's the same thing as if you have too much water in the body. You'll need to think about that and see if it makes sense. So aldosterone, target kidney, works on sodium ions and potassium ions. Cortisol and cortisone, you might have heard of these. Cortisol was mentioned a lot during the pandemic because cortisol is related to, and it's often thought of as a stress hormone, right? So cortisol targets muscles to regulate glucose metabolism. Cortisone, you can find it actually in some drugs that are used when you have a condition related to inflammation. So for example, if you have eczema, eczema shows up like a rash on the skin. So it's always a skin, it's on exterior kind of condition. And what is actually happening at your skin is your immune system is directing an inflammatory response to the skin. Now, inflammation is supposed to be a helpful thing, but if it continues over and over, it causes tissue damage. So cortisone is often added to a cream and given to individuals that they can kind of rub on their skin, and that helps to dampen down that inflammatory response. It does work, but too much use of cortisone could also damage the skin. That's one of the side effects, change the texture of the skin. Now, cortisol, in terms of targeting muscle to regulate glucose metabolism, when we talk about stress, we can talk about short-term stress or long-term stress. And short-term stress is like the fight or flight response. You know, you walk into a classroom and your teacher says, oh, I'm going to give you a surprise test today. Why, sure, that's going to cause you a bit of stress, but then when the test is over, the stress is over usually. Long-term stress is like what we had with COVID that went on for years and years and years. And that sort of stress is actually never very good. Also, the kind of stress where you might be either in a work situation or a home situation where there's an awful lot of stress. That's also not very good. Because the response is how your body starts to behave. You start to gain weight, for example. Metabolism slows down. Your immune system, for example, is not very good. It tends to dampen down the immune response, etc. Now, the adrenal medulla produces adrenaline, also called epinephrine, and noradrenaline, which is also called norepinephrine, which will target your heart and lungs to increase its rate to deal with emergencies. So the sympathetic system drives the response for the adrenal medulla. Now the pancreas. So what's shown in the image is a section, a very small section, of the pancreas and its associated organs. So the fish-shaped organ here is the pancreas. And then what we're seeing is a small portion of the first part of the small intestine. There. This here is the spleen. The spleen is not associated with the endocrine. It's not an endocrine gland. It's actually a gland that, or an organ that belongs to the immune system. But it's shown here because it is lateral to the pancreas. And they're in roughly the same location in the human body. And then you're shown some blood vessels. But what we want to focus on is, which hormones are produced by the pancreas, and again, how do these hormones work? What is the stimulus that they respond to, and what effect do they have? So the pancreas sits inferior to the stomach. The stomach would be roughly right about here in our body. So we've all heard of insulin and glucagon, and that's because these two hormones affect blood glucose levels. So these are two antagonistic pairs again. They both work, again, using a negative feedback loop. So I'm going to draw the line that I just used to explain calcium, and here's the balance. And again, let's say that this is a certain concentration of normal blood glucose. After a meal, our blood glucose level will get high. So that's an increase in blood glucose level that we see there. High levels of blood glucose continuously circulating in the body can damage blood vessels. So that's not a good thing. But we need to have energy. So insulin is secreted from the pancreas. And insulin essentially tells cells all over the body to take up glucose. So the hormone that's needed when blood glucose level is high is insulin. So insulin needs to be secreted after a meal. What will insulin cause? It will cause cells to take up glucose out of blood. So once the cells start taking up glucose out of blood, the glucose level in blood will fall back to normal. That's the corrective action. Again, that's how a negative feedback loop works. It's corrective. It reduces the initial stimulus. The pancreas stops secreting insulin. What do the cells do with the glucose? They actually convert it to glycogen. And especially the liver stores glucose as glycogen, and muscles store glucose as glycogen. And so the blood circulates around the body. It has glucose. Cells will take glucose. They will again carry out cellular respiration and produce their carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. Now, 4 to 5 hours after our meal, our blood glucose level usually will start to fall because we're not eating. So now we have a decrease in blood glucose level. That fall in glucose level is monitored. It's picked up by the pancreas. But a different hormone is secreted, and that hormone is called glucagon. So we have a lot of similar sounding words: glucagon, glycogen, glucose, and sometimes students get these mixed up. So try to remember which one is which. The on ending, glucagon, should remind you it's a hormone. So glucagon is now secreted to correct the situation. So glucagon is secreted, and what glucagon does is tell the liver to convert glycogen back to glucose. So glycogen is a storage form of glucose. So glycogen is converted back to glucose. The blood glucose level rises. Once that happens, the production of the hormone is switched off. Again, we've corrected the initial stimulus, which was a fall in blood glucose. Ovaries and testes. While ovaries and testes are both considered reproductive organs, they also act as glands because they secrete steroid hormones such as progesterone and testosterone. So we have two words, endocrine and exocrine. Exocrine glands are glands that produce a substance, but this substance does not travel in blood. It travels usually in a passageway. So like our sweat glands, for example, are exocrine glands. And some of these organs have both exocrine function and endocrine function. If we take the testes, for example, testes produce testosterone. That's a hormone. That's its endocrine function. But the testes also produce sperm. That's its exocrine function. So I'm just mentioning that so you don't get the idea that every single organ has basically just one function in the body. The human body is far more complex than that. So these were the steroid hormones. Like we said, the ovaries, so just to be sure, that there is the uterus. That's kind of where the baby will grow. Ovaries are at the very end of this tube. So there's a tube from the uterus, and then the ovaries are at the very end there. There's one on the left and one on the right. So the ovaries secrete estrogen, and another hormone called progesterone to support fertility and to prepare the uterus for pregnancy. So the ovaries help the egg that females produce to mature, usually one per month. Testes secrete testosterone during puberty, and the role of testosterone actually is significant during puberty because it has to drive the development of the male sexual characteristics, the deepening of the voice, the growth of hair on the body, increase in musculature, etc. It also plays a smaller role in sperm development. So that takes us to the end of this narration, and I hope you will find this helpful. Please make sure you do the learning check, and you can check your answers with me at a different time. Take care.